Good evening. Mr. President, it's a great pleasure to welcome you back to Davos. It's a great personal pleasure for me, not only because since you joined us the first time when you were in office and then you came back year after year. For me, it's a personal satisfaction, if I may say so, because in some way you provide us with a lot of guidance. And I would like to highlight just 3 dimensions which are so important also for what we are doing at the World Economic Forum. First, you are a person who really cares. We have seen it again and again. Second, you are a person who understands deeply the global agenda, its priorities, its long-term necessities. And we all remember your opening speech last year. And number 3, you are a person who combines vision with action, not only during your presidency, but since you left the presidency in many ways, sometimes not always sufficiently recognized by the public. You have what we have as our mission. You really have improved the state of the world, and I should say you have improved the state of many people through the actions you have taken. So welcome, Mr. President, among us here. And I also introduce a friend of mine, and I still remember, Charlie, when we had breakfast the day after 9/11 happened in New York, and we were both under the shock of this terrible event. Charlie Rose doesn't need an introduction. You all know he is one of the most respected American media persons. And what we will have now is a dialogue between you, Mr. President, and Charlie.
Thank you. Thank you, Klaus. It's an honor for me to be here, and especially to be with the man on my right. By the way, I don't know whether heart surgery is good for you, but it seems to be agreeing with you. Whatever you're doing, you look like you're in great shape.
I don't recommend the source of my diet to anyone, but it's worked out all right.
Part of what we see on the global agenda today, more than ever, you look at the United Nations, and there's now talk about poverty in the Millennium Project. Tsunami relief has made us focus on how a world can respond. HIV/AIDS has been something that you have spent a good time of your, certainly post-presidency more than ever. Tell me where you think we stand, and how is that agenda coming on, and what is necessary to do to follow the heart with action?
Well, first of all, I think, let me start with a story. When I walked out of here today, after we had the panel earlier, I told Klaus this. One member of the media said, well, don't you think this is just a bunch of rich snobs getting together and talking to each other? And isn't that a waste of time? And I said, you know, every major organization I know provides its employees an opportunity to re-examine constantly what they're doing and to plan for the future and to bring together people across lines of discipline to figure out what they're doing. And so I said more than half the people who come to Davos every year now would probably never have had serious discussions about a lot of these issues had it not been for this forum. So I can say that, you know, I used to get impatient with talking too. And I remembered once one of my predecessors in the White House, Harry Truman, said that his job consisted almost entirely in trying to persuade people to do what they should do without his asking them in the first place. In other words, there was a lot of education, a lot of persuasion, a lot of learning to be done that shouldn't surprise people. So my belief is that we're light years ahead of where we were a decade ago. There was like almost no support, for example, in the United States for any kind of substantial increase in international assistance. And then at the end of my second term, we got a tripling of the AIDS funds. We got the Millennium Debt Relief, which was really great, and we helped to put together the Global Fund on AIDS, TB, and malaria. Then you had the Republicans having the White House and the Congress. There was almost no support. Then the evangelical community got behind the AIDS effort, and you had a big increase in interest in trying to help deal with poverty. So I think that we're making progress on all this. Let's get back to the tsunami specifics. It's a whole different kettle of fish. But I think what we need is a simple unifying vision and then specific plans. I like the fact that Jeffrey Sachs, some people laughed today when he stood up and said we ought to all promise to have bed nets within 2 years. But I like that. I think, I like to be given an assignment and then go do it, and then you can tell whether I did it or not. So I like that. But I think still, there are two other things I'd like to mention. I think we need a vision of the 21st century world that basically says we would like it to be a place of sharing. We share responsibilities, we share prosperity and benefits, we share a sense of community across the religious and racial and ethnic and geographic and other lines that divide us. That in order to do that, of course, we have to have a preference for freedom over tyranny. Of course, we have to have a willingness to fight terror. But we can't basically ever defeat all of our actual or potential enemies in a world that's as open and porous as ours has to be in order for all of us to make enough money to come to Davos every year. You think about it. We'll never be able to defeat all of our actual or potential enemies militarily. So as we fight terror, we have to have a strategy to build a world with more partners and fewer terrorists, which is where the Millennium Development Goals come in, which is where an aggressive effort against climate change comes in, and where meetings like this come in, trying to sign people on to specific projects. But I think we are way ahead of where we were just 5 years ago on the anti-poverty strategy. The AIDS thing really drives me nuts. We're treating, with the end of this quarter, my foundation will treat 100,000 people with our contracts with the Indian and South African companies and the countries in Africa, India, China, the Caribbean. We're about to go into Northwest Russia. That's, I think, more than any other government in the world except what the Brazilians are doing for their own people. And it's appalling. Now, we have 30 other countries about to go on to our contract through the World Health Organization, and we could be having 2 million of the 6 million people who need the medicine get it by the end of the first quarter of next year. But I said this earlier, there was an op-ed piece in the paper, in one of them, our major papers, just attacking me for trying to get this generic medicine to poor people in Africa, saying, it was a great sham and we ought to just wait till we could give them all quality medicine. He didn't point out how many were going to die while we waited around for somebody to magically produce this money. I mean, we pay $11,000 a year for AIDS medicine in America. You can get it for $139 a year off this contract.
Is there enough?
What?
And is there enough available now for the
people
there's
in enough
Africa and people?
The answer to your question is there's enough available now for the ones we've approved. What we do is go in, if a country asks us to go in, we go in and work and help to develop a plan, then we help to set up the infrastructure. There's enough in all the places where we've gotten that far, in Rwanda, Mozambique, a lot of other places, to provide the medicine. There's not enough the production capacity right now to serve 2 million people, but there will be if we can do it. If we create the demand and we have the money, we can do it. Basically, I take my hat off to the generic producers, because even at the $500 a year they were selling it, they were following basically a high profit margin, low volume business. And now they're going for a very low profit margin, high volume business. And it's a huge gamble for them. And I'm also encouraged, there seems to be a softening, some thawing of an attitude in the United States, because the FDA, the Federal Food and Drug Administration in America, has approved a couple of these generic drugs that we use. So I'm hopeful that we're going to be making progress on it. So the answer to your question is, I feel better about this than I did 3 years ago, and I still don't think we're doing a real good job.
How do you create, I hear you, but clearly it's clearly moved higher on the agenda. And clearly there is, after something like Tsunami, a sense of urgency to move. And you got it from non-governmental organizations, you got it from the sheer compassion of people, and you got it from government. On the other hand, moving to Tsunami, people in Iran remember that there was a lot of attention for BAM, and then it seemed to fall away. How do you keep the pressure, keep the urgency, make sure that the follow-through continues, and that you do things as UNICEF is doing with water and sanitation?
Well, I think, first of all, they're basically, if you could, disaster management's a sort of separate kettle of fish, and this was one of historic proportions. But essentially, you have a short-term problem that is really being well taken care of because of the magnitude of the loss that touched all of us, because I think the global press did a fabulous job of explaining to people who didn't even know what a tsunami was, how this happened, what the consequences were, and because people just showered assistance, and then the governments did a good job. Then there's the middle term, that is what happens in the first 6 to 9 months afterward. And that's essentially when former President Bush and I started raising money for this. That's why I set up this project with UNICEF on water and sanitation, because when the water recedes and you begin to bury people or recognize that they're out to sea and you'll never find them, and you deal with all the family heartache again, the biggest threat to life in those circumstances is the absence of clean water and proper sanitation, because the children in particular in these rural areas are at high risk of dysentery, diarrhea, and maybe even cholera. So I'm trying to do that. Then I think the important thing is we need a mechanism. I've talked to the Secretary General of the UN about this a little bit, not to let donor fatigue set in on the governments. The government, most of what governments need to do is the medium to long range stuff. Once they provide, like in the case of the United States, the helicopters to drop stuff in Aceh into remote areas. What we need from government money is, contributions to long-term reconstruction. The last one I dealt with was the horrible hurricane that devastated Central America, where we promised $1 billion. And we always made our commitments, except in that case, because the Congress, in a move I bitterly opposed, said all the Central American money had to be spent in 2 years. And I see Senator Dodd out there nodding his head. He knows more about it than I do. But it was a terrible mistake, because you don't want to force people to waste money. You want them to spend the money as it is appropriate to spend it. So anyway, the NGOs have been fabulous. The people who gave have been fabulous. We have to have a medium and long-term strategy, and I hope to have more to do and say about it over the next week or two. I'm working on it. And
you're creating something called the Clinton Global Initiative, September, New York, because you believe there is a necessity to do what?
Give homework assignments.
What's it about?
Well, I've already said I really do like is a weak word. I'm very fond of and very big supporter of the Davos. But the world leaders of the rich and and the poor countries and everybody in between come to the United Nations every year in September. So what I thought we would try to do this year is to have a somewhat smaller version of what we do at the World Economic Forum, but that it would be focused very much on specific things all the participants could do. So I don't want, and it will price it about as modestly as we can to just, pay the costs we've got and everything, and we'll have it smaller than this. But anybody who comes needs to know on the front end that you're going to be asked your opinion about what we should do, for example, about AIDS, TB, malaria, what can the private sector do about global warming? Is there a way that this phenomenal outpouring of internet giving on tsunami relief can be transformed into annual giving at the and huge grassroots numbers to help meet the Millennium Development Goals? Those kinds of questions. And then you're going to be asked to participate in making very specific decisions about that and then making commitments to do something about it. So for all I know, we'll be able to hold this meeting in a small room. There may only be 10 people who want to come up and say, this is what I want to do. But I think we'll have a lot of interest because it's around the UN. I think it is very complementary to Davos. We've talked about it a lot, Klaus and I feel good about it. And I just see all these people leave here every year full of energy, wanting to do something and wanting to know there's a place where they can actually go and say, okay, what's my assignment? And so,
Professor Clinton has your homework.
Yeah, I really like what you said about the bed nets. So, it may not be the sexiest thing in the world, but if we did it, it'd make a big difference. And when they asked me to raise money for the tsunami relief with former President Bush, they said, well, of course we can't direct this to specific charities, which I agree. We want you to encourage giving. The White House had 36, I think, something like that, charities on the website, and then 12 more that are capable of handling large money. And I said, but how am I going to keep score? How am I going to know how many people whose lives we saved and communities we put back together, whatever? I think it's very important that those of us who come to meetings like this at some point have a chance to do what Ted Turner does with his foundation, or Bill Gates does with his foundation, or other people do all the time. We need to know we did this thing and it got that result. And if I could just say one other thing too, I saw another gentleman out there. I think I may have said something today, and I saw it on CNN, that was misinterpreted when I said anybody who uses the corruption or the absence of capacity in poor countries as an excuse not to give aid should be sent into a closet. I agree with that still. I didn't mean to say that there is no corruption and no incapacity and we don't have to worry about it. We do. Wherever there is corruption, where there's incapacity, it should be addressed. But the point I was trying to make is we know how to do this. And it's amazing to me when we give out general aid to countries, all this millennial development stuff, some percentage of it should be devoted to capacity building. It's like every company, and as I said, the military has leadership capacity. We know how to do it. So I wanted to clarify that. I didn't come out for corruption in my earlier remarks today.
Even if the government is not perfect, we ought to make sure that the momentum goes forward. Let me turn to where we are in this 2005 January. We've had one election on January 9th. We have another one Sunday in Iraq. Some people are saying that we're on the cusp of a moment that can make a difference. You've seen lots of moments in 8 years of public office. You devoted a lot of time to the Middle East. Tell me what you think the possibilities are and what's necessary. And let me begin with Iraq and this upcoming election.
Well, first of all, whether you think the United States is the right thing there or not, we are where we are, and the world would be better off if we had a representative, effective government in Iraq capable of providing security to its people, basic services, and attracting opportunity that connects the people of Iraq to their neighbors and to the larger world in a positive way. Therefore, this election is important. Now, in the areas that are relatively safe, a whole lot of people are going to vote. And in the areas that aren't safe, principally the Sunni central part of the country. Depending on what happens on Election Day, the vote may be weighed down. Given the way the election, the electoral system was set up, if that happens, let's assume the worst case, low voter turnout among the Sunnis, high voter turnout among the Kurds and the Shiites. If the way the election was set up, if they choose the people who are elected, can draft a new constitution and set up a system of government which will discriminate against the Sunnis who agree with them, who want some sort of parliamentary system, who want peace, who don't like terror, but didn't show up at the polls because they didn't want to be blown away. So it seems to me that the most important thing is if you assume there will be some level of problems where there's been a big insurrection and terrorist acts, and the voter turnout will be lower. If you just assume that for the moment. If the voter turnout is uniform throughout the country, everything's fine. But let's just assume the voter turnout will be lower. Then I think there will be an enormous moral obligation on the Shiites and the Kurds and the others who are elected in the areas where there was no trouble to make sure that the constitutional system they set up fairly represents all the religious and tribal groups of Iraq, more or less in proportion to their population, so that their legitimate interests can be protected by when we actually get a permanent government up and going. It seems to me that's the biggest thing. We're going to have some people vote in some areas and not such a big vote in other areas, but the people who win should feel a moral obligation to do that. I mean, the reason we ever got an Irish peace agreement is because the Catholics and the Protestants agreed to share decision-making and shared benefits, as well as shared responsibilities. And in Lebanon, they have a system where the 4 different elected officials have to come from different groups. And if you live in a climate like they've lived through, I think that's important. So that, to me, that's the most important thing. The other thing I would say,
have to reach out to the Sunnis and say, come in,
look,
come in here in proportion to your population and help us draft a constitution.
Let's suppose 80% of the Shiites show up, 70% of the Kurds show up, and 40% of the Sunnis show up. I mean, I don't know if that's going to happen, but let's suppose something like that. They should nonetheless draft that constitution so that ultimately, in the beginning of this new Iraqi republic, all the groups will be fairly and decently represented in the government and will have a chance to feel that they are part of the future. The other thing I think is that the United States, I was glad to see us accept the offer of the Germans. I think we should have accepted the offer of the French. I think we ought to accept the offer of any competent country that can help us train more security people more quickly, because we need to increase the capacity of the Iraqis to defend themselves. Because we need to get out of there, but we don't need a timetable. I'm totally against setting a timetable. I'd be against it if my party tried to impose one on the president. We got to stay there and do the job, but if we stay there too long, a certain percentage of people will believe we're there for the oil or for imperialist reasons and not to try to make the deal work. So I think that's important. But the most important thing is that when the Iraqis who win in this election do right by those who couldn't vote.
So they reach out to the people who couldn't vote and make sure they're part of it.
And give them a part of the future. Yeah.
Do you have confidence that this government will, as they write the Constitution, will not be a mirror image of the Iranian theocracy?
Oh, yeah.
You do?
The Shiites have been pretty smart about that. And if you look at the Iran's a whole different kettle of fish. But it's a sad story that really began in the 1950s when the United States deposed Mr. Mossadegh, who was an elected parliamentary Democrat, and brought the Shah back in.
CIA.
And then he was overturned by the Ayatollah Khomeini, driving us into the arms of one Saddam Hussein. And most of the terrible things Saddam Hussein did in the 1980s, he did with the full knowing support of the United States government, because he was in Iran, and Iran was what it was because we got rid of their parliamentary democracy back in the 50s. At least that's my belief. I know it's not popular for an American ever to say anything like this, but I think it's true. And And I apologize. When President Khatami was elected, I publicly acknowledged that the United States had actively overthrown Mossadegh, and I apologize for it. And I hope that we could have some rapprochement with Iran. I think basically the Europeans' initiative to Iran to try to figure out a way to defuse the nuclear crisis is a good one. I think President Bush has done so far the right thing by not taking a military option off the table but not pushing it too much. I didn't like the story that looked like the military option had been elevated above a diplomatic option. But Iran is the most perplexing problem in a way we face today for the following reasons. It's the only country in the world with two governments. And the only country in the world that has now had 6 elections since the first election of President Khatami. The only one with elections, including the United States, including Israel, including you name it. It is the only country where the liberals or the progressives have won 2/3 to 70% of the vote in 6 elections. 2 for president, 2 for the parliament, the modulates, 2 for the mayoralities. In every single election, the guys I identify with got 2/3 to 70% of the vote. There is no other country in the world I can say it about, certainly not my own.
But those are the guys that are in power, and is a power right. held by another party?
Okay, but here's the problem. Under their constitution, the Religious Council, headed by the Ayatollah Khamenei, has the authority over intelligence funding, terrorism funding, and has the power to invalidate laws and scratch candidates from the candidate list. So the people that represent the 30% to a third, can negate much of what this 2/3 to 70% want, and the president is in the middle getting whipsawed, and the people underneath him supporting him get more and more disillusioned. Now, they still kind of like the West in general and America in particular because we don't represent what they don't like about the governing of Iran since Ayatollah Khomeini. What no one can answer is, number one, how would those 2/3 react if some military action were taken?
What's your guess?
It depends on what it is. But, I mean, there may not be. Everybody talks about what the Israelis did at Osirak in 1981, which I think in retrospect was a really good thing. You know, it kept Saddam from developing nuclear power. But they had that available. It's not clear to me that that option is available in Iran. And it's not clear to me that if we did a lot more than that and a lot of civilians got killed, that you wouldn't lose the 2/3 you've got. And it's also, you're not fooling with Iraq. You know, one of the they can say whatever they want. I mean, one of the reasons that we did this is that this guy didn't have the capacity to hurt its neighbors and the United States. Iran is more than 3 times as big. They have a very sophisticated network. I will never forget as long as I live, September the 11th, I was in Australia, and 2 people who worked for me in the White House called me from Lower Manhattan and talked me through the second plane hitting the second tower. I'll never forget it. And I said, you know, bin Laden did this the minute the plane hit the tower. And they said, how do you know? I said, because only bin Laden and the Iranians could have done it. And the Iranians didn't do it because they have a country, they have targets. We'd have to level Tehran if they did this. Bin Laden lives in a cave in Afghanistan. But they're not without means, in other words. They're very smart. They're very well funded. They funded my old friend Turkey Faisal's out there. We went through all the hell we went through after Khobar Tower in Saudi Arabia and all the 19 United States airmen that were killed. So this is something. I still hope there's a diplomatic solution. It is madness. There is an elected government in Iran supported by 2/3 of the people that wants a rapprochement with the West.
Okay, but let me ask a couple of questions. One, should
and we can't get there. It's crazy.
And if the Israelis indicate that they might want to do it, what should the United States say?
Well, the question is, first of all, I think we ought to not do any until we have exhausted all reasonable diplomatic efforts. Keep in mind, again, this is heresy. The reason you should not want Iran to have an active nuclear program is not that they might not have a bomb. India has bombs. Pakistan has bombs.
Israel has bombs.
Yeah, but so what happens? Well, you know what my number one worry between India and Pakistan was? In the beginning, when they started these bomb building programs, we knew more about their programs and their doctrines than they knew about each other. Plus, the Pakistanis were, a lot of the people in their military and intelligence service were tight with the Taliban, and I was worried about the security of the materials. So, but deterrence still works just like it did between us and the Soviet Union. So wait a minute. So if Iran had a nuclear weapon, the main thing it would do is cast a pall over the Middle East. But they'd have to think a long time before they used it because they'd be toast if they used it. So what is the real worry? Well, wait a minute. What is the real worry? If you've ever seen these facilities, the real worry is same worry we had with Pakistan. What if the people representing the third in Iran that have the religious council decide that fissile material should be smuggled out of Iran and given to a terrorist group? If you have we now know this, you can get on the internet and see this, but if you have basically a cookie's worth of fissile material and you put it into a traditional bomb, you can amplify the destructive power by hundredfold or more. So the reason you don't want Iran to have an active nuclear program is, given the present state of play, you will never know whether the materials are secure or being transported to terrorist networks.
But the question is, and it comes to the Oval Office and it comes to other places, if they're about to have it and they say that by 2005, at the end of 2005, it may be too late, what do you do if negotiations haven't worked? I mean, what's the hard call for a president of the United States?
In 1981, you mentioned Israel. In 1981, Israel bombed a nuclear reactor that was ostensibly set up to generate power at a place called Osirak in Iraq. They took it out, and it served the desired purpose. It delayed Saddam Hussein's ability to develop nuclear power for a considerable number of years. Now, keep in mind, I hadn't seen any intelligence in 4 years now. Some people think I didn't see him before then. I don't know. But
what kind of intelligence are they talking about?
Or they thought I didn't have the intelligence to understand the intelligence. But anyway, that was then, this is now. I don't know that there is a target in Iran which could be taken out with 1 or 2 bombs with almost no civilian casualties, right? Nobody's saying no effect. I don't know if that option is available now. It may be. I'm not saying it is. I just don't know.
But everybody says it's much more difficult.
It's much more difficult. They are a much more formidable foe, and I'm not entirely convinced that what our British and German and French and other friends are trying to do won't work. And you know, there ought to be some sort of mega deal there. That you know, the religious council in Iran is not entirely shut down democracy. They haven't totally invalidated everything they've tried to do. I think there's still a lot of internal back and forth going on there. And I personally believe that we ought to give some final vigorous push to diplomacy to try to deal with this.
What's the carrot and the stick, though? If you talk about diplomacy, what do you give them? You say there'll be no economic sanctions, there'll be no kinds of sanctions of any kind. We'll give you an opportunity to participate. We'll encourage you to participate in global trade. We'll do what?
Yeah, all of the above, and there are lots of other details. I mean, the British, the French, and Germans, they had a whole deal worked out there. And then the Iranians didn't stay with it, and they wanted to go back, and we're kind of, back and forth. But a lot of this involves how you define national greatness.
What do you mean?
Well, I think every country's image of itself is rather like a person's image of himself or herself. It's the product of the accumulated dreams and nightmares of your family. Think about it. I remember I had a screaming match with Boris Yeltsin one time when he was telling me I couldn't expand NATO. And finally I grabbed him and I said, Boris, look at me. All the time we spent together, you really think that I would send American jets to an airport in Warsaw and use that base to bomb Russia? I said, look at me, you believe that? He said, no, I don't, but a lot of old ladies in Western Russia do. He said,
no, or a lot of generals.
He said, look, he said, it's irrational. Of course it is. But he said, it's irrational to you because you live in a big country protected by 2 oceans. You were never invaded by Napoleon and Hitler. He said, everything we do is affected by these nightmares. Similarly, the Chinese with whom I worked and was very close and got them in the World Trade Organization, they did things I thought were nuts and self-defeating in fighting political dissent and stifling debate and, having no dialogue with the Dalai Lama, which I thought was but not just morally wrong, but didn't make sense. To crush the Tibetan culture and do all that. I didn't get it, And I talked to a bunch of them. They said, we do a lot of things that look crazy to you because our #1 nightmare is internal disintegration. And you never had internal disintegration in your country.
Can I come
So all I'm saying is the Iranians, if their image of their national greatness either does or does not require them psychologically and in terms of where they're going to have nuclear weapons, if they ever use them, they'd be toast. Just like, that's why nobody ever did it in the Cold War. But we don't want them to have it because even if they never used them, it would affect the politics of the Middle East, #1. And #2, the more people that have these weapons, the more nuclear material you got around, the more vulnerable it is to pilfering. It is a serious problem. The one thing we have not done a good job of since 9/11 is we haven't spent nearly enough money and done nearly enough work to contain the nuclear, chemical, and biological substances in the world. So that's where we are. But I don't have an easy answer.
No. And let me talk about the American president who just got reelected. And he said that he thought that reelection showed that the American people believed he was right in Iraq. Is that the way you read that election?
No, not necessarily. I don't. I think actually there's been quite a lot of research about this election, from which you can draw 3 or 4 pretty good conclusions. We got about a draw in Iraq. It was about a wash. About as many people were against the policy as for it. I think he won the election because 4% of the people made up their mind in the last 24 hours. And they wanted to vote for a new president. And in the end, they didn't because they thought that Bush would be better on security based not on Iraq, but based on their perception of how the president responded to 9/11 and what happened after that and the fact that we'd had no more terrorist attacks in the United States. And overwhelmingly, that 4% broke for Bush, and that was the tail of the election. And there were in the last week, there was another 3 or 4% that did it. So if all those people had hung around there till the end trying to make up their mind, they were obviously prepared to vote for Senator Kerry. They obviously, and so I think that he ought to follow the do-right rule in Iraq, but it wasn't a vote for the Iraq thing. I think
what's the do-right rule?
Just what I said earlier. Have this, make sure we do everything we can to get this election carried off, then encourage the electors to use their power to give a government that will be fairly representative of all elements of Iraqi society, develop their capacity for self-defense to maintain their own security as quickly as possible, and leave at the earliest appropriate date to prove we never were there for bad motives. But don't set a timetable which will set ourselves up for failure and set themselves up for more terrorism.
In the end, you think they'll need more American troops?
I don't know, and I don't know if we can do it. I mean, I thought we had too few troops in Afghanistan for a long time. We're back up to 20,000 now, I guess, 18, 20,000. It's still not enough for us to undertake this comprehensive hunt for bin Laden. But we've got these guardsmen and reservists staying too long.
Do you think there's a tipping point in which the American people would turn against our presence in Iraq?
Yeah, but we're not there yet.
What would it take to get there?
I have no idea. That's like setting a deadline to get out.
Yeah.
If anybody knew the answer to that, we'd all be, you know, you could set up a, so who's that guy in the Pentagon that was set up a futures market?
Yes.
And bad things happen? I don't know, but sure, there's a tipping point. I watched it, and but we should be trying to make it work. You know,
What should the president be doing that hasn't done to make it work?
Well, I don't know. First of all, let's see what happens in the elections. And then there may be some things he can do to accelerate the development of security forces.
I want to talk about a lot of issues that you're concerned about, in China especially, and you've met with the leadership of China a number of times, and that has to do with environment, has to do with the fact that, as I understand it, the Chinese have a very strong presence here, and they have conversations about what's happening in Iran and the Russian oil and a whole lot of things. But let me just stay with this one point. The President of the United States made a speech, an inaugural speech, which he talked about freedom, that the purpose of American foreign policy is the expansion of liberty, that American policy was about promoting freedom. Did you like that speech? Did you agree with what he said? Is it what represents
well, I think
the America that
first of all, the answer, the honest answer of every thoughtful person to that question would have to be yes, but I'm not sure. For the following reason, freedom has been the primary purpose of our foreign policy since the end of World War II. Woodrow Wilson at Versailles argued for national self-determination. It's in the deep, you know, we basically left colonialism behind when Teddy Roosevelt decided that he hadn't been right in some of the things that he said and argued for. But we got ourselves into some quasi-colonialist situations in the Cold War because anybody that was against the Soviet Union was our friend, no matter what they were doing to their own people. We got ourselves into some real trouble. But it's been the nominal purpose of our foreign policy from the beginning. I don't know how many speeches I gave when I was president saying that we should be for freedom and democracy, because democracies normally don't go to war with one another, normally don't condone terrorism, normally observe the rule of law. So at one level, I think that's what he said was right. Now, the devil is in the details. What does that mean? Does that mean that anybody's against privatization of Social Security accounts at home is against freedom? Does it mean that anybody that's not for any preemptive attack on a non-democratic state is against freedom? Does it mean the president has failed his own test if he continues to do business with China and Russia, even when it's manifestly in the interest of the United States for him to do so? So I think that we will have to await the second chapter of this speech, which is, what is the policy content? Did it reflect a change in policy? But I thought there were some fine phrases in there and some things that no American and very few people across the world could disagree with. But the question is, what does it mean in terms of domestic and especially in terms of international policy?
Is it more difficult for us, for the United States, to promote democracy because of what's happened in Iraq and because of whatever implications that's been for America's reputation?
Well, it's more difficult for people who think we did the wrong thing to invade before the United Nations finished its inspections. And it's more difficult, that's the liberal more difficult. The conservative more difficult is, it's more difficult if they need our military power, because a whole lot of it's tied up in Iraq, and we can't undertake they cannot easily undertake another major military exercise now. It's all we can do to maintain our commitments in Korea, in Europe, in very small amounts in other places in the world, and our major commitment, I say major, in Afghanistan, where we got about 20,000 troops. That's really
So we're less likely to launch another preemptive action, you think, because of...
Well, it depends. You asked me about, I said it depends on what it is, and you asked me about Iran. You don't need ground forces if you're just going to go take out a facility. unless they come after you.
If you're not going to occupy it, you don't need ground forces.
Yeah, but I think it is what we learned in Iraq, actually, from a military point of view. Again, you all know I talked about this last year. What I thought about that. I thought we should have let the United Nations and Hans Blix finish the inspections. I felt that. But now that this has been done, I also believe we all have a big stake in the success of the enterprise. I think there are a lot of good people in Iraq who want to run their own affairs, have their own country, be independent, and be decent to one another. That is, hold a very complex country together. But it's what we learned is that the military was organized from the end of the Cold War throughout my presidency to try to make us able to fight two regional wars at the same time. In doing that, we tried to do a lot of things. I won't bore you with all the military modernization stuff we did. But the point is, we could do that. But what we hadn't planned on was a large-scale occupation of given territory in the aftermath of a conflict that would have to be undertaken primarily by the United States. So our military doctrine did what it was supposed to do. We could depose Saddam Hussein and depose the Taliban. But if we had to be, and that we could stay in Afghanistan where we had an broad international support, and everybody was doing it. But when we did the thing in Iraq and a lot of people didn't support it, it became an enormously difficult thing. I mean, you can't, the children of a lot of my friends are in or have been in Iraq, and I know a lot of the military commanders, and it's difficult because we never planned in our post-Cold War planning for a major America-only occupation, or where we did most of the occupation. And, for example, I'll give you, in Bosnia and Kosovo, the United States did over 80% of the military activity, but was only asked to do, in the case of Kosovo, 15%, in the case of Bosnia, a little more than that, of the peacekeeping, when we had the international peacekeeping, because the global community supported what we were doing, or we supported them, if you will. So if we're going to go off and do these preemptive things, there's not going to be a lot of people riding into the sunset with us, and we don't have a military that comes close to being able to do that and meet our other basic needs.
But that raises this question. It is clear that you have a pretty good relationship with President Bush.
I do.
He came down and said a lot of very nice things when you dedicated your library. When you were in the hospital, he called several times, I think. Do you have a sense of his recognition with respect to where?
Yeah, I would say, I made a comment at my Rainey Library dedication, my presidential library dedication, that I made a crack to a friend of mine 3 days before the election, and I was convinced now that I was the only person in the entire United States who liked both George Bush and John Kerry. Because we're so deeply divided. Now, I don't agree with the administration's policy on the budget, on the environment, and on a whole host of other issues. I have profound disagreements with them, and I've articulated them. And I don't agree with the politics that have been enormously successful of the Republican right since the mid-'70s rise of the so-called moral majority, of this personally demonizing all the Democrats. But I find it fruitless to hate them over it and whine about it. Everybody says, oh, it's terrible the way the religious right and the right-wingers in America, they're so mean and they're so terrible. And let me ask you something, all of you. If you had a business that produced $500 million a year for you in income and you never had to change what you were doing, would you ever change your business strategy as long as you could make $500 million without lifting a finger? I mean, all they did to John Kerry with that Swift boat ad's what they've been doing since 1980. And they're in business to beat us.
Yeah, but
so my view is, I'm through being mad at them. I'm mad at us if we're not smart enough to figure out how to stop them from beating us on illegitimate tactics. I think that, we ought to, that's what we ought to do. And so I decided at some point that I was not going to get caught up in this. And I confess, I like President Bush personally. I think he's a lot, he's different from me in a lot of ways. But we grew up, no, I don't mean, psychologically, but we grew up in the same part of the world, and I get him. And I told, way back in 2000, I told the people who were trying to help Al Gore that he was, cleverer than people thought he was, and he was a good politician. And it seems to me that we should be trying, those of us who've been president, to find common ground without giving up what we agree. So President Bush and I, we've agreed to disagree on tax cuts and global warming and whether the Songus National Forest should be savaged and a lot of other things. And we have found what we can work together on, and we're doing it. And I respect that, and I will do what I can.
Let me talk about two quick things. One is that you think there's nothing you spent more time in the White House focusing on in the foreign policy area than Israeli-Palestinian issues. I mean, Yasser Arafat, I think, came to the White House 12 times.
He knew the way.
He knew the way. You had that amazing moment in which your friend Yitzhak Rabin shook his hand. What should Arab states do? What should the Palestinians do? What should the United States do at this moment to make sure that we seize this moment?
Well, first of all, let's talk about what's happened. Mr. Abbas, and I have a hard time not calling Abu Mazen, has been elected. He won, as far as we can tell, a free and fair election that President Carter and many others observed. And he has gone out of his way to try to not only speak against, but work against the terror. Ariel Sharon has said he's going to get out of Gaza and has given up his party's governance for a national unity government with his old personal friend and political foe, Shimon Peres. This is good. And you got America and Europe. Tony Blair was giving that great speech yesterday about this, eager to get involved again. And whenever the regional powers like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and America and the Europeans, whenever we're all involved, fewer people die. Whenever we get out and just let it fester, more people die. So the first thing I would say is we should all get involved again, even if we don't succeed in making a peace. Fewer people will die and fewer bad things will happen. Okay, so what should be done now? The Prime Minister of the Palestinians has done what he said he would do, and assuming he continues to do it, I think that they should work together and effect the Gaza withdrawal as promptly as possible.
What he did is that he would take the initiative in dealing with security issues. That's correct,
and he's doing a good job.
Palestinian
That's correct.
territory.
Assuming that continues to be done in good faith, and believe me, the Israelis will know whether it is, and so will we. We should proceed with Gaza. Number one. Number two, then everybody will want to take a deep breath, because the coalition government that Ariel Sharon has is still not the government of Ehud Barak or Yitzhak Rabin. And time has passed, and there are more Israelis in the territories, in the West Bank, number one. Number two, the Palestinians are larger, younger, and poorer in numbers than they were when we began this in 1993. What we must not do is let delay destroy the prospect of peace. I agree you can't rush into this, but let me remind everybody, a lot of the harshest critics of the Oslo Agreement, which was signed on the lawn of the White House in '93, are in danger of supporting a process that repeats its biggest weakness. The biggest weakness of Oslo was this, and I supported it, and I still support it, but the biggest weakness was, look, these two parties that have been at each other's throats for a long time have decided to make peace. They're going to do easy things first and hard things last. They're going to resolve big territory last, Jerusalem last, right of return last. We're going to do the easy stuff first, the hard stuff last, and we'll get to help, we'll trust each other during the easy things, and it'll become possible to do the hard things. That was the whole concept, right? By the way, I still think we'd have made it if Rabin hadn't been murdered in '95. The guy that killed him got what he wanted. That's my honest belief. But as all of you who know me know, I'm very partial to him, and I miss him every day. I think we'd have made peace if he hadn't been murdered.
Why would it have been different? What was he prepared to do that Ariel Sharon?
No. I think Barack went maybe even further than Rabin would have. Right. But Rabin was there earlier in time. You didn't have as many scars. And Rabin had a certain standing that was unparalleled in the psyche of the Middle East, in the mind of Arafat and others. And I wrote about this in my book. I don't want to delay. We're getting off the subject. But anyway, I think it would be a mistake now to say, okay, now we've done Gaza, now let's take a time out and reinstitute the roadmap. And I'm not critical of the roadmap. That's the President Bush's roadmap. That's not what I'm saying. We had a time out for the Intifada for the last several years, during which nothing happened. If you put the roadmap back now without accelerating the timetable, you're just waiting for the Palestinians to again become younger, poorer, and more numerous. So what should be done? There needs probably to be a second stage in which the United States and others, Europe and others, put some serious money into the Palestinian territories. Not just into the government, but into the entrepreneurs. Maybe even setting up some NGO entrepreneur-to-entrepreneur deal. But these people can't keep getting shafted. I mean, it was really smart. The enemies of peace were great. When they saw what we decided to do at Oslo, every time we'd do something good and we'd start chugging along, the Hamas or the Islamic Jihad or somebody would blow up a bomb and they would close Gaza. And the Palestinian economy would collapse, even though 90-something% of the Palestinians had nothing to do with anything like this. So we have got to set up an independent pipeline of funds and development. It's not very expensive. We're talking about tiny little money here that make a huge, huge difference. And to show them, to make something good happen, then I think we need a timetable which is realistic to see whether the current national unity government in Israel and the Palestinians can make agreements over the long term. But my opinion is worthless. What's really important is that the Palestinians and the Israelis agree on something. I'm just telling you what I think. My gut is that we need to not let the thing just simmer. That I've never seen, never, in all these years I've been watching, it looks to me like delay has always been our enemy there.
Finally, you avoided a heart attack.
Lucky.
You got that book written. You may write another one, novel, maybe a mystery or something else.
My life was a mystery to me.
Still is.
Yeah, I got lucky.
You got that library built. People ought to come to Arkansas and take a look at it.
Yeah, it's good.
And see history. Tell me what you think, my last question, is the best way, and I've asked you this before, to spend your time, your energy, your intelligence, your relationships around the world, which is unique today.
I think the best.
And what can you do?
I think the best thing for me to do is to, through my foundation and working with the UN or the U.S. government, or anybody else that asks me to, I should do whatever I can to help to create an integrated global community where we have shared benefits and shared responsibilities, and we don't fight because of our differences. And that's an ideal, but we have a highly interdependent world which produces things like 9/11 and the violence between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Interdependence means we can't escape each other. But the interdependence also means that over 30% of American households will send money to tsunami victims half a world away, over half of them over the internet. An event totally without precedent in human history, and I think is the beginning of the democratization of international assistance. So I think anything I can do to accelerate that process in a way that changes lives for the better is good. I have, I think a lot about the good I did as president. I think a lot about the mistakes I made. Like I've often said, I don't know that I'll ever get over the fact that we never even seriously considered going into Rwanda. I think we could have saved 200,000 or 300,000 lives. It happened in 90 days. So there's no way I could have done a deployment back then with the Congress all against it in time to save even half the lives. But I could have saved some lives. I have to live with that. And I've reached a point now in my life, I got to live my dreams. I've had a great life. I still have a great life. And, my primary political interest is in trying to help the junior senator from New York get reelected. So I have no other political...
Reelected and elected.
I have no way. That's her business, not mine. I'm for whatever she's for. But my personal life is, I just wake up every day saying, how lucky did I get, right? And so my goal is, I just don't want anybody younger than me to die before they have to have their dreams broken, to be sick. I don't want anybody. And so I'm going to spend the rest of my life doing what I can to stop that from happening.
The 42nd President of the United States, William Jefferson Clinton. Thank you.
Thank you.